Now we want to major on the EU referendum. It will perhaps, although you might not regard it so, be one of the most important decisions you make, not only for you, but for your families and the next generation. It will be one of the most important decisions you probably make in your adult life. And we've had everything. We've had Project Fear on both sides, and we've had regular bombarding of our screens and our radios and our newspapers with a lot of scaremongering, and Project Fear, as I say, is on both sides. Now, the most recent contributions, Boris Johnson backs Brexit project. He calls it European liberalisation, European liberalism. David Cameron said his most recent comment, peace in Europe would be at risk if Britain votes to leave. All this with 6 weeks to go. So today we thought we'd have another 50 minutes of debate. You're all invited to be involved, either hands up or indeed through tweeting on hashtag BIBA with caps, panel lowercase. And I'd like now, one by one, for you to give a big welcome to our panel. First, for remaining in the EU, we have the leading economist, formerly once upon a time at RBS, Vicky Pryce, who worked for Exxon, KPMG's chief economist too, and is an expert on the likelihood of crises in the Eurozone. Vicky Pryce, please. For exiting the EU, please welcome the leading economist, Roger Bootle. He's the Managing Director of Capital Economics, previously in the Bank of England's monetary policy. He's a columnist for the Daily Telegraph, and he's just released a new book, The Trouble with Europe. Roger Bootle. Now, for Remain, we have a new member of the House of Lords, Baroness Michelle Mone, OBE. She's an entrepreneur and the government small business czar. She built up the Ultimo brand before she sold it, and now she concentrates on rebuilding communities. Please welcome Michelle Mone. And Michelle Mone currently is working very closely with Ian Duncan Smith, who's actually a very big Brexit person, so I can't imagine what the conversations are like there. Finally, Matthew Elliott, the Chief Executive of Vote Leave Campaign Committee, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He believes in ending what he calls the supremacy of EU law, and he has absolutely no links to UKIP. Matthew Elliott. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a debate with all your questions, but first up, I'm going to ask the panel very briefly for perhaps the most passionate reason that they're in favour of staying or going. Vicky Pryce, what's the most passionate argument you make for staying?
Well, for me, it is because the economy will suffer, both in the short term and the long term. We will lose considerably in terms of productivity, and will be increasing uncertainty quite substantially. So for business, it makes absolutely no sense to leave.
But of course, all changes at first seen as deprivation. And I mean, certainty is not necessarily always a good thing.
Oh, that is true, and some people can make lots of money out of this. But if this uncertainty means lower investment in particular, if it means that foreign direct investment is no longer keen to come into here, then it means losses of jobs, it means a reduction in productivity, and the trade benefits that we're getting at present will no longer be translated into more prosperity in the economy.
Roger, your most passionate argument for leaving?
Oh, the thing that most exercises me is the prospect of my country, our country, becoming again a normal, independent country, sovereign, able to do what it democratically chooses to do. And as a large part of that, of course, is taking full and effective control of its borders.
Michelle Mone, your passionate reason for Remain?
First of all, my mic is working. Hello, Kirsty. I'd just like to say as well, any small guys around, stay out of my way. There's a warning at the moment. Okay, so just lightening things up a bit. Today is the first day where I've really come out and said anything, because I've stayed away from it deliberately, because I've still been sitting on the fence and still trying to make up my mind. But I think at the end of the day, if you were to ask me right now, you have to make up your mind, I would say that we have to remain in, because we need stability, and I think there's far too much to risk. It will take like 5 years to renegotiate terms for business and everything else, and I think it would be much safer for us to remain in for the security of our country, for business for our country. And that's the reason why I just think, you know, really don't want to take the risk. So.
Matthew, for leaving.
For me, well, my background previously was from founding the Taxpayers Alliance. So one of my key things is the £350 million a week which we send over to the EU. And I sort of think, what could we do with that money? That money would be better spent, were it to be spent by British people in the UK rather than being sent over to Brussels.
Right, well, there's the opening statements. Right now, though, I have got a tweet from Laura High Foster. If it's fit for purpose, why would we reject an ever closer union with the EU? Michelle.
I just think that, you know, if we get our terms that we need for our country, I do find it really uncomfortable that 60% of our laws are decided by Brussels. I'm uncomfortable with that, and I think we are, you know, getting better terms, as we did do with the Scottish referendum as well, which I was involved in. And, you know, I would like to say as well that I'm a big fan of Ian Duncan Smith. I worked with him with the review for 9 months for start-up businesses in the UK, and I think he's got some valid, good reasons as well. But, yeah, I do think that the best thing to do for all of us and for businesses is to stay within.
Now, Matthew, I mean, the point is that ever closer union is not necessarily a given, is it? I mean, it's not, you can't make the point that there would be ever closer union if we remain, because you don't know that.
I can understand why lots of people like Michelle are still slightly uncertain and slightly on the fence on this issue, because we're really facing two futures here. This isn't like the Scottish referendum where it's the status quo versus a big change. Actually, it's two futures. There's one future with the EU where they've got their 5 presidents report, which talks about further centralisation, further powers flowing to Brussels, and another future, as I would see, where we can be a good neighbour, trading with the EU, cooperating with the EU, but not being a member of the EU.
Okay, on trade, let's just talk about this, and I really am looking for questions. Let's talk about trade, because what I seriously do not understand is if we are going to do trading within the EU, and we're going to have access to markets the way that we do at the moment, we will have to give something. And the thing we'll probably give is free movement of peoples.
No, I completely disagree. The issue is this thing called the single market. And lots of people have argued during this debate that we absolutely must stay in the single market in order to have access to that market. This is complete and utter twaddle. We don't have to be in the single market in order to trade with the single market. America is not in the single market, not seeking to join it either. Australia isn't, South Korea isn't, Singapore isn't, all these countries, China isn't. All these countries sell into the single market. So the stance that we should take is to stand outside the single market. And being outside the single market, we don't have to obey its rules.
Vicky Price.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Of course, quite a lot of goods are traded into Europe from other countries, and that's absolutely true. So that will carry on happening, and will carry on happening from the UK as well. Because although tariffs on goods have been eliminated and are reduced everywhere, there is a big issue about non-tariff barriers. And the single market gives you a set of rules and regulations which allows the ability to export our services. We are serious surplus country. We're a surplus country in terms of the trade in financial services, for example, which of course is represented here. So a lot of that will be lost, and all the calculations that have been made on looking at any other an alternative in terms of the trade arrangements to what we have now, in other words, being in the single market, leads to less growth and less trade and poorer UK as a result.
Michelle.
Kirsty, I would just like to say that what made me exceptionally nervous on Monday was a statement from HSBC Global Bank that said that, you know, for business, for the risk of our economy, they said it's better for us to remain. And I know that we have lots of issues that have to be dealt with, but I think we need to deal with those issues remaining in, because I think the risks are far too high.
And of course, it's a question of passporting for global companies, whether or not they would actually make their headquarters here, or they'll move to Frankfurt or move to Paris or so forth, if we are out with the EU?
Well, we've heard these arguments before, actually. We heard them over the issue of whether Britain should join the euro. Exactly the same people, same organisations were then saying, if we don't join the euro, we're going to leave the UK or we're going to transfer jobs to Frankfurt or whatever. In fact, there was a considerable movement of opinion saying that Frankfurt was going to become the new European financial capital. This, of course, would prove to be completely wrong. Now, we might well lose a little bit of business. Some jobs might go to Frankfurt or Paris or whatever. There may well be other jobs created to offset those. I wouldn't want to set our economic and social and political course on the basis of what HSBC or Goldman Sachs say is in their economic interest.
Vicky Price, what do we get for the 350 million that Matthew says that we shouldn't be handing to the EU?
Well, it's really interesting. Of course, this figure has been disputed by the Statistics Authority, which actually says it's 260. It's still quite a lot, but net it's 260.
What do we get?
What we get, actually, is a Europe which is considerably more integrated than would otherwise be the case, which helps us in terms of ensuring that we can sell our goods and services across. It is a contribution we make. A lot of that goes into the poorer countries. We used to receive a huge amount on structural funds. Now we don't need it as much. There are all these Eastern European countries there. What it does do is it increases prosperity in Europe. But in reality, it's tiny. You may think that 10 billion overall is a lot, but if you just calculate what the likely short-term shock and uncertainty will be, you're already seeing that in terms of investments slowing down and so on. You can lose that 10 million just like that on day one.
There's a question down at the front here. Microphone paddle 1, please.
Hi, it's Graham from Bee But No Beer in my hand at the moment. I wonder if the panel could give us a view of what are the economic advantages and disadvantages for people in this room, the general insurance industry specifically, for staying in Europe.
The disadvantages, Matthew, as far as you would see it, staying in Europe for the insurance industry.
Well, we've heard lots of claims about how we were going to have a single market in services. And to be frank, that single market in services and financial services hasn't really come about to the extent that we were promised. And instead, we have laws and regulations for the insurance industry made, frankly, in Brussels by unelected politicians, whereas I think they'd be far better made in the UK by politicians who we elect. I think another key point is that so much financial regulation now is made at the global level. Now, Britain needs to be there at the top table globally, shaping these regulations, rather than being represented by the EU at these top tables.
Who thinks, by the way, that EU regulation is bad for the insurance industry? Gentleman in the middle, low in hand. Not many people agree with you, Matthew.
Well, Robert Hiscox is one of our board members at Business of Britain, who I think is quite a big player in this industry.
Vicky Price.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, of course, the insurance sector is quite fragmented in Europe. There are different regulations in different countries. And, of course, there are different pension arrangements. We are much more developed than they are. The whole point of the Capital Markets Union and the further integration in the financial sector, which is being pushed now by the Commission, is to achieve the ability to actually increase, in fact, our own representation in Europe considerably more than is the case right now on much more equal terms.
Michelle.
My business 20 years ago, well, I sold Ultimo last October, but my business got quite a few grants from the European Union to start, and I would really worry about that as well, that, you know, that I think I received something like, at the start, £6,000, which was a lot of money that managed to achieve growing Ultimo into a global brand. But without that funding, that initial funding, then it would have been tough. And doing the government review in startup businesses for the last 9 months, there's been a lot of businesses who have had European funding for marketing, etc., and websites. So that would worry me as well.
Roger.
Yes, on that point, I understand Michelle's concern about those startup grants. But the fact of the matter is that in that case, and indeed just about every case that we could talk of where people are getting European Union funding, what's happening, of course, is they are getting back some of the money that we are paying to the European Union. And whatever grants these people currently enjoy, we could replicate outside the European Union and still have whatever the figure is, 10 or 11 billion left over.
Matthew.
Can I just add to that? So for every £2 we put into the EU, we just get £1 back. So were we to retake control over the £350 million a week...
But we have automatic access to a market of 500 million people.
I think we have access outside. Let me just be clear on this point. There is a a European free trade area that
Yep.
runs through from Iceland right through to the Russian border.
Yep.
The idea that Britain, on leaving the EU, wouldn't be part of this free trading area is simply for the birds. We'd be part of it.
Vicky.
Well, I think we will have access. There's no doubt about that. We'll have to negotiate that. But I think I agree entirely, Kirsty, with the question you asked at the beginning. All the countries that do have access to this free trade area have to accept free movement of people. I personally think that's pretty good. It's pretty good for the city. It's pretty good for the UK as a whole. And actually, look at Norway, look at Switzerland, look at anyone who's actually directly in Europe, actually dealing with Europe. That's what they have to do. Otherwise, they can't trade.
This word access can be extremely misleading. You've just said, Vicky, every country that has access to this area, this market, has to accept free movement of people. America?
No.
America trades
said
with
in
Singapore.
Europe.
But
I
they haven't got
said in
access.
Europe.
The key point is, do they actually
was
trade
careful.
with it? Countries all around the world trade with it without having to accept migrants or make a contribution to the budget.
Well, let's move the debate on. We've talked now about insurance, but I want to bring in generally what people think of the EU referendum coming up. Let's talk about and I know this is an issue for the insurance industry, getting the brightest and best people to work in your industry. Matthew, that presumably shows that what we have here is a huge pot of people that we can draw on.
We do have a huge pot of people in the EU, but the key point is this. By having that huge, uncontrolled migration from the EU, we're basically cutting off the best and the brightest from the rest of the world. It'd be far better for the British people, for the British Parliament, to control Britain's borders and decide which people with which skills from across the world they want working and living in the UK.
But there already is a point system for people from all over the world.
But because we have uncontrolled migration from the EU, that means that fewer people from outside of the EU are coming than perhaps would have done, because David Cameron has said that he's going to keep migration down to tens of thousands, which of course is broken.
In terms of compressing wages down and so forth, has EU migration been good for British jobs, as it were? It would tell us of British jobs, or has it been bad for British jobs?
Well, can I first of all say that lots of countries, of course, trade with Europe, but they don't have free trade arrangements, so to have unlimited access to the market. So that's a very, very big difference to the US. But yes, in terms of particular levels of wages, I think it's accepted that at low skill levels, what you have seen indeed is that wages are perhaps being kept slightly lower than they otherwise would be. But of course, overall, we seem to be attracting very skilled people from Europe. And of course, businesses have profited in terms of having those skills, perhaps not paying them huge amounts of money, but that way they make profits, they hire more people. The result is that we have one of the highest employment rates we've seen in quite some time in the UK, despite the huge increase of migrants.
I think it's worth saying that even the leader of the Stronger In campaign, the Remain campaign, Stuart Rose, says that were we to leave, wages for the low-skilled would go up. So if we're looking out for what the have-nots want, what's good for the have-nots is actually for a Brexit vote here to help wage the lowest levels.
There's a microphone 4. Where are you, please? Microphone 4. Yeah, up at the back. Yes, can we have your question, please?
Hi, it's James from Bluefin. My question centres around basically reversing the scenario. So if this was, should we join Europe rather than should we leave,
Exactly.
does the argument remain the same?
Michelle Moan.
That's a good point, and I haven't heard that question before. I think we'd have to look at it. I think we'd have to see what the benefits are, but we have to look at it that we're in just now and what would the risk of us being leaving. So that maybe doesn't answer your question. I think it's too risky at the moment. Too risky for security, too risky for business, and I think it's better we're part of something bigger remaining in than leaving. If you were to, hindsight's a wonderful thing, if you were to have the debate on us joining, if we weren't in it, then I've never really thought of it that way, but I think you'd have to start the negotiations, but we are in it now, and what's the risk to your industry of leaving? I think there's a big risk of you leaving. big
Roger.
risk to jobs and a big risk to...
I think there's next to no chance that the British people would vote to join the EU, and it is, of course, the EU rather than Europe, if we were currently not in the EU. And that tells you something, I think, about the nature of the argument. There's playing on Project Fear and people's natural conservatism with a small c. There are very few clear arguments for joining from a blank sheet of paper. It's interesting in this regard that the people of Switzerland and Norway, of course, are in precisely this position, and their elites have tried to bully them into joining the EU.
And they're very well off too.
And
Wait a minute,
extremely
but-
well off, and they've voted against.
But remember, at the time that we were considering whether we were joining the EU or not, we'd come out of the Second World War. And the idea was that it would be a bulwark against war. Look at it, just in terms of geopolitics now, let's look at what's happening from the East, from Russia and so forth. The rush of countries that wanted to be in as a bulwark against the East. Does that not exist anymore?
I don't think it's really at all convincing to argue that the EU's been a bulwark against war. In the early decades, I think it helped to cement friendship between France and Germany, and I wasn't against the EU. I voted to remain, by the way, in '75. But over recent decades, it's a different kettle of fish altogether. It's NATO that's kept the peace and indeed prevented some sort of ruction or invasion by the Soviet Union, now Russia. On that score, by the way, if we're relying on the rest of the EU to defend us, then heaven help us. They've got barely any armed forces anyway. Those of you who saw the Yes Minister sketch some years ago, someone says to the minister, let's pray, hope and pray that if the Russians come, they come during the week, because if they attack over the weekend, all the troops will have gone off for the weekend.
Vicky Price. And for those of you who don't know, this is quite interesting. I think Vicky is Greek, and I think that is interesting.
Oh, well, I am. I'd like to look at the EU in a different way. I would vote to join the EU most definitely, because it has actually had huge benefits in terms of trade, in terms of productivity and growth in the UK economy. Even the people who want to leave admit that this is the case, and has been historically the case. But of course, in terms of politically and how it's gone and how the EU has worked, yes, I'm Greek. And of course, the interesting thing for me is the way in which a lot of the expansion has been for political reasons, not necessarily economic reasons, and we have to bear that in mind. It is the UK that pushed quite considerably to get the Eastern European countries, former Soviet Union countries, to join the EU. So we have been instrumental in this. It's not as if it's happened without us knowing. Quite the opposite. And Greece, Spain, and Portugal joining, when they did, it was after a period of dictatorships. And what it does, joining the EU, is it guarantees democracy.
But wait a minute, look at the far right. There are far right parties that are rising in some of the new countries since 2004.
And exactly, and what is happening right now in Poland is that Poland is under review. And if it doesn't, in fact, meet the sort of democracy criteria that we have, it will be suspended from a number of dealings with the EU. And I think that is serious. So we mustn't forget that. And the other European countries that are trying to come in have similar problems, particularly because of the proximity to Russia and why they want to join.
Microphone number 2, please. Can you say who you are? Where are you? Thank you very much indeed. And then we'll have microphone 3. Is there anyone over this side? Right, let's take microphone 2.
Hi there, my name's Benjamin Heinsohn from Marsh, and I was just wondering if the panel could comment on the effect of young people that the Brexit or staying in the EU would have. Sure.
Thank you very much. Matthew.
Well, I think there's an interesting question here about young people across the EU. And if you look at the levels of youth unemployment in Spain and Portugal and Italy, sometimes well over 50% youth unemployment, that's a direct result of the EU project and the Eurozone. And coming back to this point about Greece, frankly, if I was living in Greece, I'd probably want to be part of the EU. But Britain's in a different situation, with the 5th largest economy in the world, the 4th biggest armed forces, we've got a position on the UN Security Council. We are different to countries like Greece or the other East European countries.
Michelle.
Yeah, I would like to just ask you a question, okay? Why do you think the Prime Minister wants us to remain in?
It's a good question, that. Sorry.
Are you not
I
going
take
to
the
answer
question.
it?
Well, I'm going to let you answer in a second, but could you answer the point about for young people first of all, Michelle?
I think it's so much better. There's many more opportunities for young people. And purely, I'm sitting here as a business person, and I don't think business needs any more disruption. I think what we need to do is gain stability. Stability is key. We've not really had stability for a long, long time. with the Scottish referendum, that still, you know, uncertainty and everything else, then with the general election, and now we've got the EU, but I think there's much bigger things going on in the world as well. I mean, I'm really, really concerned about the American vote that's coming as well. I think that's probably, I'm sorry guys, it's probably more
Donald Trump
important
wants Britain out anyway. You'd be glad about that. You'd really love that endorsement.
You might well think that I couldn't possibly comment.
So
Okay.
the
Can I
whole
ask
world
the
has to
question?
calm down, I think.
Yeah.
The whole
I mean,
world needs stability, and we need to get on with
Well,
business.
let's
because it's
talk about-
business that's been at risk.
I'm going to get you to Matthew to answer that question, but I want Vicky to answer the question from the gentleman who asked it.
I mean, youth unemployment is a serious problem, and of course in Europe, as Matthew is suggesting quite rightly, is huge. So in Greece it's over 50%. But of course that is the problem of the euro and the way in which it was actually imposed on countries. I was always completely against the euro from the very beginning. Perhaps Roger, who I love dearly, and we've been very good friends for a long time, can explain why he laughed.
Yes? Oh, thank you. Yes. Oh, lovely. I get a look in. Yes, I laugh because you talk as though the euro sort of descended like manna from heaven, from the Lord above. This is the EU's project. It's the EU's biggest project. This
Okay.
is the whole point. It's
We
the
didn't
biggest
join
thing
But
that
you
it
don't- but
does
you don't
causes mass unemployment.
But you don't have to be in the euro to be in the EU.
No, but what does it tell you
And
about
what
the
is more,
EU?
all right, but what is more, I mean, the point I was going to make before Roger rudely interrupted was that despite that, this is the interesting thing, despite all that, and the terrible things it's done to Greek growth, and my own family has been affected considerably, the majority of Greeks want to stay in the euro, and particularly because they want to stay in the EU.
And
I mean,
the
the
EU will
trouble is
bail
that the one of the things, I mean, all of you who travel in any part of continental Europe will see, you know, I mean, the largesse of the EU has been fantastic. I mean, there's been, you know, all this incredible development and so forth. You know, there was a kind of splash and spend, crash and, you know, splash and burn on, that wasn't exactly a good advert for the EU, was it?
Oh my God, this is precisely what we actually wanted the EU to do, in the sense of a lot of redevelopment that needed to take place. The structural funds, the infrastructure funds from the European Investment Bank have come to this country as well. I remember in the 80s, as partner at KPMG, actually obtaining Objective 1 status for Merseyside, Objective 2 status for various boroughs in London, because we were really poor.
So, in fact, a lot of EU money came into deprived areas that you've been visiting, and it still comes in.
The key point is this, though, that for every £2 we put in, we get £1 back. And nobody on the Leave side is suggesting that the areas that still get structural funds, like parts of Cornwall and the North East and what have you, wouldn't continue to get money from the UK government rather than the EU.
But of course, overall, we have become richer. So the thing that we have always complained about the euro is that it didn't have the institutional framework to allow redistribution of money to the poorer countries so they can survive, like Greece. And here we are complaining about the fact that we have all agreed the new methodology, which has all to do with where the sort of regional average may be in various countries by comparison to the European average, to ensure these countries don't remain poor forever, because it's very good for us to have this market developing too.
Right. Now, we would have loved to have David Cameron here today, but we couldn't have him. So Matthew's going to answer a question on his behalf. Why is David Cameron for Remain? Because that's what Michelle wants to know, but Michelle actually is in his party.
I think that lots of Conservatives, and I count myself as a Conservative, really admired the Prime Minister's Bloomberg speech when he said, I'm going to have this process of renegotiation followed by a referendum. And he wanted lots of different changes. He wanted powers brought back to the member states. He wanted to reassert the sovereignty of national parliaments. He wanted to protect the non-Eurozone member states, all this sort of stuff. The fact is that when he actually started the negotiation, he didn't get what he set out to do. So he didn't get the change that Britain needed. So therefore, we're left in a situation where we're voting to remain in an unreformed EU or to leave. Now, for lots of Conservatives like myself or like Ian Duncan-Smith and Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, they've made the decision that actually, because we've got an unreformed EU, the safer choice, the less risky choice, is to vote leave.
Thank you very much. Now we've got microphones at 3 and 4 and 5. But I'm going to take microphone 4 first.
Hello. I'm Sarah Farden from Willis Towers Watson. I mean, we're all business people in this room, and we're obviously interested in looking at the bottom line, accountability. I'm interested in the opinions of Vicky and Michelle, particularly around accountability within Europe, because the budgets for Europe have not been signed off for many a year, and also the accountability around unelected officials, really. So what options do we have? You know, we're trying to run our businesses tightly, but we're in a larger organisation, in effect, where we don't appear to have that control.
Michelle?
Well, I tend to agree with you because, sorry to say it, I say it as it is, wear my heart on my sleeve, but I do think that some of the people in Brussels, I mean, they're quite useless MPs that have got the job. So I don't agree with all of them, but we just have to tighten things up. But you've got to think about if we weren't in the EU, I think there's a far greater risk. And I have to make the point that
What have
majority
MEPs
of
won? I
people-
mean, you say they're useless, but
well, they're
they
like
won-
the you know, D-grade MPs, so they get thrown over there. I don't think they're really powerful
We agree.
people.
We
I
definitely
do agree. I have to agree with that. So there's things that I don't like about it, and there's things that I do like about it. But in the grand scheme of things, I believe that the public are really confused, which worries me. And but I think the public will decide. And I love you. You're a nice guy. If you were smaller, I'd have picked you up, as I said on the stage. But
She was trying to.
I was trying to backstage.
Yes.
But I do believe that the public, we all want stability. Far too much risk. There are things that need to change. I mean, we don't live in a perfect world. We never will live in a perfect world. We have to keep working at things. But I think at the end of the day, it's much better for us to remain in.
Vicky?
Look, it's interesting what you're saying because it is a very, very important issue. Of course, we do elect MEPs. Remember that in many cases we've elected many more UKIP MEPs who have no real interest in getting anything sort of pushed forward in Europe, and they absent themselves from various decisions. But it is quite interesting that we have Whitehall departments which are unelected, of course, and they do lots of things which we don't approve of and mess things up. I'm afraid I was a civil servant myself, and I can't say we've been perfect in this either. But we have a Council of Ministers, which is made up of ministers that we sent out to debate various things with others. And it's interesting, whatever people say about our laws here, that we have been on the winning side much more often than on the losing side.
But interrogating Remain in the same way you interrogate Leave, I mean, are you happy with the status quo? And as Matthew said, a lot of what David Cameron wanted to get, he did not get in the renegotiation. So is that it? Or do you have a prospectus for change as part of Remain?
Well, I personally think that he did get quite a lot. Particularly the non-discrimination and the ability to scrutinise and vote things down more often. But I think the main problem we have is ourselves here. By which I mean that we don't, and I've noticed this as a civil servant, we don't scrutinise enough, we don't spend enough time on European issues, we react to things that are happening rather late. And yet right now we have, as heads of various committees which are really influential, British people who are there doing them. So we actually improved this a lot. We have Lord Hill, who's of course very important in your case because of course he's in charge of the Capital Markets Union and financial sector more generally. But I think there is perhaps a reform that needs to happen, and other countries want the same. It is that national governments become more actively involved in what goes on in Europe. There is no reason why we can't get that to happen and get the others to agree that too. I think there are enough out there who want the same thing.
Microphone 3, please.
Hi, Kirsty. My name is Hutton, and I'm from a company called Landmark. I've got a question for Roger, really. He was speaking earlier, suggesting we could be a member of the European Free Trade Zone, such as Switzerland and Norway. However, those countries, as we know, have to abide by the rules on free movement of people. So I'm not quite sure how we would be any different to what we are
Norway
now.
takes free movement of people.
And also he suggested there are other, he listed another, a number of countries such as the States and China and Singapore, who are obviously not part of that and can trade with us, but surely they are subject to import tariffs. So could Roger sort of give us the details of how, in the real world, our trade would not be disadvantaged if we were outside of the EFTA, or alternatively, if we are part of the EFTA, how we would circumvent the requirements for free trade, free movement of people, and other
You negotiate the other negotiated deals, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what you said, I didn't say. That's to say, I didn't say that the UK should or will belong to one of those groupings, although it is an option. I quite purposely, actually, compared the UK to the position of every other country around the world which trades with the single market. Now, if Britain were in that position, it's perfectly clear from the success of those countries selling into the single market that we would be able to trade very well. Now, to answer your question directly, would that be, in a sense, more difficult? I think at the margin it would be a bit more difficult because there would be customs controls, there'd be documents to fill in and so on.
And would there be this lapsed period?
Yeah, can I just finish this? A very important point. He's asked a really big, vital question here. We would pay the tariff, of course, which is around about 4% on average, which is next to nothing. I'm not denying that that is some sort of cost for British industry.
Small business.
The question is, if we didn't get a deal, by the way, the question is, how serious is that? Let me put this to you. If the single market is so fantastically important, could someone please explain to me why so many of its members are doing so badly? Why isn't Greece and Italy surging forward on a great wave of prosperity through not having to fill in forms at borders? The evidence is plain as a pikestaff that advantageous to the single market might be, it can't really amount to very much.
Why is the prosperity not spread better?
I do disagree because I think, Kirsty, there's going to be a lot of quotas that will be introduced, and that's going to stop business. And business doesn't need any more red tape. It's hard enough to have a business. But I do believe that quotas will start to be introduced, which will have a massive impact on trading and a massive impact on business.
Vicky?
Well, I think it will happen. It will happen. I remember, it was about 12 years ago, we had 900,000 push-up bras on the sea, and we couldn't get them in because of
pollution's a terrible thing.
Right, so luckily it wasn't like, food or anything. I weren't going out to date, but they were stuck on the sea. We couldn't get them in because of a quota issue, and that's what will
Into
happen.
which country?
Bringing them in here.
From
From
South Korea?
No, from China.
And that's because of the quotas imposed by the EU on the British market.
But I do believe that we are going to have quota issues. No, but I do believe that we will have quota issues if we're not part.
There was the bra quota.
There's a bra quota. So your company was disadvantaged by the EU.
This was between China. I know what you're trying to say.
She's saying that this will be the same with the UK, and that's what she's trying to say.
No. The quota, there would be quotas. Look, you're talking about Barack Obama says that he's much more interested, of course, although they've not got it yet, in actually doing the deal with 500 million Europeans rather than doing a special British deal. And there would be quotas for different things. There'll be certain forms of protection.
Let me explain more seriously. So,
yeah, no, it was a European Union quota, but what I'm saying is there will be more quotas and it will be worse. And at that time in our business, that was an absolute nightmare. Yes, we're part of the European Union, but I believe if we weren't part of the European Union, it'd be a much worse situation.
Matthew.
The UK has a huge trade deficit when it comes to the trade in goods with the EU. A huge trade deficit. So the idea that post a leave vote, they would allow sort of tariffs and quotas to be brought in just wouldn't happen. So it would hugely disadvantage the countries across the EU more than it would disadvantage us. Can you imagine a situation where the bosses of BMW, Mercedes, all the other German car manufacturers would allow Angela Merkel to bring in tariffs, or the French food producers or wine producers, or the Italian fashion producers? They wouldn't allow these tariffs to come in because the UK is the biggest single customer of the rest of the EU.
Right, I'm not going to go to every panelist. There's lots of hands up, which is great, and we have only got 9 minutes left. So, microphone 1, then 2, then 4. 1, please.
Good morning, Ed Butler from Poole Re. A question for the two gentlemen about security. Why has the leaders of the Out campaign so violently disagreed with the former head of MI5, MI6, and all the former SecDefs from the US that we're going to be less secure if we come out?
Do you want to?
Matthew.
I think it's worth pointing out that the Justice Secretary in the UK knows a lot about these things. Michael Gove is part of the Leave campaign, but also Dearlove, another former head of MI6, is also supportive of a leave vote. So I think these issues are quite nuanced. Specifically on security, Britain's security is guaranteed by two things. First of all, NATO, not the European Army. Secondly, the Five Eyes network. The Five Eyes network is basically the spy agencies in the Anglosphere, essentially, Britain, America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, working together to guarantee Britain's security. Frankly, the French have a good spy system. None of the other countries, Germany has a pretty good one. The other countries don't have one. The idea that we want to stay in the EU and have the single European spy agency that President Juncker's talking about and sharing our secrets with the other 27 member states wouldn't actually help us.
Right. Okay, question 2.
Thank you. Nicholas Davenport, EIS Partners. Roger Bootle said at the beginning that a few people might lose their job in the financial services industries if we came out of the EU. I think that's absolutely wrong. My own business would fail immediately. Every person in this room has access to the whole single market through passporting. I suspect they would be affected. And you might say, well, of course, passporting will continue if we were on the outside. I don't think it will. Donald Tusk said the other day, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
That's very good for a statement, so I think we'll leave that there because your point very well made. Let's move on to 3, please. Microphone 3.
Hello, Terry Moyes from Forbes Insurance. We deal with an insurer, particularly in Europe, where we're placing business to that insurer. I was with them last week, and not only do they deal with us, they deal with several other brokers in the UK. They would not want to lose that business. The CEO told me that she would be writing to her MP, making that position clear that Brexit, they want to carry on operating. And that conversation must be happening in every industry across the place. We also sell insurance to EU citizens, so we have clients in various EU territories. So there are benefits to us. Against that, the price of regulation is massive. That was brought in by the EU, forced upon us as an industry. Very expensive, very little benefit to the consumer. Secondly, the issues around commission disclosure, a very big thing for everyone in this room, that could be forced upon us by the EU.
That's great because you've just done a statement for leaving, you've just done a statement for staying, so I feel I've covered that equally. So let's take a question now. Gentleman at microphone 1.
Just to answer that on Norway, by the way, Norway is subject to every single piece of financial services legislation that we've discussed. Hugh Evans from the ABI. Could the panel perhaps explain why it thinks that if the UK demands a divorce after 44 years, it would get better terms than when it's married?
Vicky?
No, I don't think it will. I think it's going to be pretty difficult, and the rest of Europe isn't going to be particularly inclined to give us any great deals. And actually, I mean, loads of companies in Europe will relish the fact that they can now start competing a bit more against us. And I think actually regulation will be imposed here too. I mean, if you just look generally at financial regulation, we have done quite well in terms of getting our way in most areas of financial regulation, but we are actually, in Europe, but we're actually tougher in general than the Europeans are. And I would be astonished if things actually ease here at all as a result of leaving.
Can I pick up the Norway point? I'll leave matters of marriage and divorce to my good friend Matthew here. On Norway, he's perfectly right, of course. Very few people, there are some people, but very few people, I think, on our side would suggest that Britain ought to go for the Norwegian option. I can't see the attraction of it at all. It's a bit like voting to leave the EU, going through all that fuss and bother and potentially upsetting people, then waking up the next morning and finding you're about sort of 95% still in the EU. And, you know, frankly, therefore, it's highly misleading to say Norway has to do this, Norway has to do that. I would be remotely interested in the Norwegian option.
Matthew?
What needs to happen in Europe as a whole, specifically the EU and the Eurozone, is actually further centralisation to make the Eurozone work. And actually what would happen upon a leave vote is actually a rethinking of the architecture of the whole of the EU. So you'd get the Eurozone countries more closely centralising under the Five Presidents report. Like Vicky was saying, they need to have fiscal transfers between the Eurozone member states to actually make the Eurozone work. So they would become more of a super state. and then you get a new deal for basically the non-Eurozone and non-EU countries, where you'd still be able to trade with the whole of the continent, but you wouldn't be part of this superstructure. So that natural situation would occur, and it would spark that, because that needs to happen. And leading thinkers like Jacques Delors, President Giscard, this is the sort of architecture for the EU these pro-Europeans are talking about for afterwards.
Thank you very much,
Look,
Michelle.
I think we can get all confused by your really intelligent quotes, but you're all sort of quoting the same things. It's like déjà vu and all the rest of it, and you're all speaking the same language constantly. I mean, I know that's what you all do, but for the general public, great question on divorce. Having been through a really bad divorce myself, it's taken 3 years to do it. Can you imagine us being divorced from the EU? I just think that business, it will go on and on and on and on for years, when at the end of the day, it'll be much safer for us, more stability, staying within. And there's great arguments of leaving. Honestly, I do agree with you in parts of it. But when it comes to it, and you've got to vote yes or no, I might agree with you, 60% of it. But if I'm going to make a decision, I'm going to vote yes to stay.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes, 17 seconds. Question 4, make it a short question, I'll get short answers.
Okay, Adele from Peter Best Insurance. Can I ask the panel to comment on what Michelle said with regards to the overall destabilisation that Brexit will cause? Because it's a valid point, it's a security issue. It may then reignite the Scottish referendum, and the whole thing becomes just rolls out of control. But it's a valid point that's not yet been answered.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about what would happen if Scotland votes yes and England votes no.
A key thing happened last week in the Scottish Parliament election. The SNP lost their majority. So now there's no longer a majority, even within the Scottish Parliament, for a second referendum. And they didn't actually stand on having another referendum on their manifesto. And in fact, it's the UK Parliament who'd actually have to decide that. So I think the idea there'd be this second referendum in Scotland just won't happen. And more importantly, there isn't actually that much difference in the polling between the rest of the UK and Scotland when it comes to
I disagree with you. She will definitely call another referendum. It's going to happen. That is going to happen, and we're much, much better being part. I am so passionate about Scotland. I'm Scottish through and through, but I'm also British, and it's better being part. And that's why I went out there campaigning to be part of it. It is going to happen.
Well, I mean, the point is that it is actually the British Prime Minister who decides, but it's whether or not he would stand in the way of it. That's the question. Vicky.
Well, from the economic viewpoint, everyone agrees that it's going to be a shock to the economy. We're already seeing expectations of interest rates actually going up for particular, possibly even mortgages. People are already beginning to talk about a risk premium will be downgraded probably as a nation.
Of it.
Banks are already discussing this. Of course, that will be up to, and of course, sterling is likely to fall quite significantly. It may be good in the long term in terms of our exports, but actually it is quite a shock, and it will increase, of course, inflation too. On the other hand, I think certainly the Bank of England is going to put so much money into the economy just to ease the situation, plus probably will be buying sterling. But overall, I can't see how either investment can be kept up, how people will be wanting to see what this renegotiation will lead to. And I think this period of uncertainty could be quite substantial and will be there for quite a few years.
Just very, very quickly, you're getting the last word. Are you too blasé and underestimating what instability does?
I've never been accused of being too blasé. It's impossible to be too blasé or too rich. Can we just respond to that lady's question? Because when he took part of it, actually, which was the Scottish thing, she made, I think, partly your question as well, a valid point about could this not cause instability across Europe? I think that is a reasonable concern, frankly. That's to say things would have to change. The question is whether you think they've got to change anyway for Europe's good. That's what I believe. Europe can't carry on like this. These political structures are not working for the people of Europe. So yes, there would be change. There would be a period of uncertainty where Europe found a new way forward.
Well, I know Michelle's got a 3-line whip in the House of Lords this afternoon, so everybody's got to go on time. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Thank you to our panel.